I am so privileged to be able to include him as a regular on this show. David Cay Johnston, everyone. Co-founder of DCReport.org. Hi, David. I want to mention I saw a great piece on DC Report just yesterday, and yesterday, the day before. Sorry, I don't know. The days run together, but I wanted to ask you, at least start in this place, David, because we're seeing judges in America take hold of life in America in more and more aggressive ways. And this is something that you talk about on DC Report and have spoken of before. I know you've stepped back a bit from DC Report, the daily operations, but it continues to sort of have your sensibilities. And I think that's a real good thing, because this is something that really, it could be a watershed sort of change in the way life proceeds in America. And it's being driven by these justices at the federal level, many of whom were populated by the last administration, by the Trump administration.
Well, we have rules at the federal level, and so do most local jurisdictions, to prevent what's called judge shopping. At federal courthouses, there's a random number generator and says your case goes to this judge. The problem is that in Amarillo, Texas, there's only one federal judge. So you had a group that is vehemently opposed to any form of abortion, and I would expect in a future litigation any form of birth control. And they were invented after the Dobbs decision last summer that reversed Roe versus Wade in Amarillo. They were given standing. Standing means you have a reason to be part of a lawsuit and to bring a lawsuit. And I'm astonished that they were granted standing except for this judge, who is a very radical, reactionary Trump appointee in this case. His decision violates a fundamental tenet of the judiciary. Judges sometimes will write an opinion telling you they don't like a particular administration policy, and they will say something along the lines of, however, regardless of the court's view of the administration's policy, our authority does not extend to second guessing the administrative agency unless they have egregiously violated their own standards for reaching a decision. There's a particular case I've written about that's been going on for 20 years on oil pipelines and how they collect from customers federal income taxes, which they never have to give to the government. For the people who collect it, there's about 175 pipelines, and it's a few thousand people. It's not the owners of the pipelines. The controlling owners and the executives get the money. It's, by my count, over $2 billion a year, or $3 billion a year. Congress says I'm wrong. It's $2 billion a year. But be that as it may, it's a lot of money to a handful of people. And the judge in the case keeps saying exactly this, whatever I think of the decisions of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, it is not my position to second guess their judgment. And this judge, in his opinion, doesn't talk about fetuses. He talks about unborn people. And I think he's taking a signal here from the Supreme Court decision in Dobbs. My apologies, the barking dog.
I love it. Yeah.
My apologies. Yeah. Because in Dobbs, you'll recall, the court cited as legal authorities for overturning Roe two actual 17th century witch hunters.
That's right.
So, this is,
you're right.
Here. There's a solution, by the way, to this problem. When you have a one judge court, the answer to that is to consolidate several of the courts for filing purposes. And if you live in Amarillo and have to go down to Dallas or Houston or some other populated center, maybe El Paso, well, tough luck, because we shouldn't set up a system here to forum shop to get a particular judge, particularly when that judge is known for his not following procedure.
Yeah, I mean, he's a jihadist, is what I mean. If you look back and see his right when he hit the street out of college, I mean, this was the top agenda item for him. I mean, he's been active in rolling back women's reproductive rights and trying to get this done, and he was finally in a position to do it. And I think you make such a good point, David, and I'd forgotten, sort of in the smoke of this latest thing, that the Supreme Court decision quotes, this centuries-old sort of ruling, and then this Texas judge, he points to an 1870s ruling. So you're really. Is this where the law is now, David Cay Johnston? I mean,
this is a real fundamental problem that is a very new and modern problem. It's driven by the Federalist Society and Mitch McConnell. It is contrary to the tradition of American law. Now, American courts overall have tended to be, for 240 years, quite conservative. Judges tend to follow. They don't very often lead. Only during the era when the Supreme Court was addressing racial inequities and essentially beating up on dumb people, things like the Miranda decision, where you have to advise someone upon their arrest of their right to remain silent. At the time, back in the 60s, there were all sorts of declarations this would lead to gross lawlessness and law enforcement could never function again. And of course, that turned out to be utter nonsense. But we've seen a willingness to embrace criminal activity by law enforcement or the federal agencies. I mean, a good example of this would be waterboarding, which dates to at least the Spanish Inquisition. We executed Japanese officers after World War II for waterboarding. And yet the George W. Bush White House, in an opinion by Professor John Yoo, now at the UC Berkeley Law School, held that no, this was legal, never mind the actions of our own government and the Geneva Treaty and other international law. And we need to be very troubled about that. And let me add one little story to this. In the book Parting of the Waters, which is about Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement, near the opening of the book, it's almost the opening story, they tell of civil rights lawyers before Judge Frank Johnson in Alabama, the first serious non-racist judge in Alabama. And he calls them into his chambers for a discussion and says, and they make an argument, and not in the book is that the judge turns to my late father-in-law, who represented segregationist schools before the Supreme Court, and people like that. Very principled man, but held deeply racist views. And my father-in-law says, well, Judge Johnson, I have 400 years of unbroken history on my side in this case. And the judge says, yes, you do, sir, until right now. Now, that's a different kind of activist here, because what Johnson was doing was stopping the second-class treatment in the area that litigation dealt with. He wasn't taking away rights from white people. You don't have a right to be abusive and to deny people the ability to vote or to send their kids to school. He was expanding the franchise. What we're seeing now is a dedicated effort to take away voting rights, make it harder to vote, take away rights for women. And in the case out of Amarillo that we have a DC report, this is a drug approved 22 years ago, which has proven enormously safe and far safer than any other option for ending a pregnancy. So the underlying basis of the judge's action is anti-science. Unfortunately, the Republican Party, with its current leadership, is anti-science.
Kim had a question about the judges in this country and their general, the breadth of their ability to rule on things. Kim, will you follow?
I had an earlier question. I was just wondering about something, because Mark was talking about, and you were just mentioning, how this drug has been available for more than 20 years, how a federal agency tasked with approving it had done all the research to do so. And so what business does the judge have then to come in and countermand the agency? And I had wondered, what, if ever, the judicial system or judges have been limited in the scope of what they can and can't rule on? And I did get an answer. John Daly texted me that a League of Women Voters, a thing about the Constitution making it clear, with a few exceptions, that Congress may decide what types of cases the court may hear and the procedures for doing so. This says that with enough political will and a willing president, it's within Congress's authority to limit the U.S. Supreme Court's power by restricting what type of appeals it may accept. I don't know if we'll ever get to that point. It would be great if we could.
Well, Kim, I mean, remember, in all things in the law, it cuts both ways. Every sword can be a shield. Every shield can be a sword, which is in my first lecture to my law school students at Syracuse University every year. In this matter, the Congress certainly can limit the jurisdiction of a district judge to his jurisdiction. That is, this judge can say, you cannot sell or provide this particular medication within this district until this is litigated. When circuit courts of appeal decide these things, generally their decisions are limited to the circuit they're in. And when we get conflicting decisions, so the Fifth Circuit in Houston, which is so conservative that its longest serving judge has held that a man on trial for his life whose lawyer was drunk, snored through most of the trial, and never questioned a witness, had adequate representation of counsel and could be put to death. Whereas the Ninth Circuit in San Francisco and Los Angeles tends to have a little more humane view of the world. And when you get a conflict, then the Supreme Court tends to take these up. The Supreme Court will now take up this case. It may be a while, but they will take it up because we have, I think it's the Second Circuit, and it'll go to the Fifth Circuit from Amarillo. But absolutely, Congress can pass rules. And by the way, the Constitution doesn't say the Supreme Court has the right to rule what's unconstitutional. You can reasonably infer that from the Constitution. But it was in Marbury versus Madison in the early 1800s, dealing with a commission, a federal commission, that the outgoing administration of John Adams didn't deliver until after the new administration was in office, and it was held to be invalid, that the court upheld or invented, reasonably invented, but invented the right to hold things are unconstitutional. I don't know who else would do that, but we can certainly adopt rules about the Supreme Court. I think the most important one to adopt right now is for Congress to require that Supreme Court justices comply with judicial ethics rules that apply to every other judge in America. They apply to traffic court judges, because we shouldn't have Clarence Thomas getting millions of dollars, and apparently it is, in fact, over the decades, millions of dollars in free vacations from Harlan Crow, who certainly wouldn't be taking him on vacation if he was a traffic court judge. By the way, a job that I think that Justice Thomas is well suited for.
Yeah, you said before, I think, that you have no problem with him as long as he's a traffic court judge.
Yep.
So that's the answer. So the answer is technically Congress could restrict the cases that would make it to the high court. I mean, just in the case of the Supreme Court.
Yeah, of course, the Supreme Court would then rule on that also.
Yeah.
But if we do it by constitutional amendment, which is very hard to do intentionally, so it's difficult, but we've done it 27 times in 240 years. We could amend the Constitution to focus on these issues. And the underlying point is that judges are not supposed to rule in favor of their biases. And we have lots and lots of cases of, for example, mass-going Catholic judges who have issued rulings contrary to the teachings of the Catholic Church because they're not supposed to consider the teachings of the Catholic Church. And that's what we are getting, unfortunately, away from. We are getting ideological judges who say, this is the way I think, and I now have the power to make you do what I say. Absolutely not.
Yeah, this is true. Just before I get to Perry Joe Jim Bob's point, you're so right. You could make the argument, I think, cleanly, David Cay Johnston, that judge, rather than ruling in this case, should have recused himself from the case. I mean, given his background, given his activism in this area, I mean, as I say, I'm sorry. I mean, he's really a radical activist in this area of reproductive rights. You should recuse yourself.
He is. And for those folks who aren't watching, Perry Joe Jim Bob has written something that's very interesting. The drug, talking about the drug that induces abortion, a much better version than what the Old Testament recipe is for a drug to induce an abortion. The drug isn't the problem, it's the means to an end. Next will be attacks on same-sex marriages, interracial marriages, etc. I agree with you. I think that you're going to see an assault on contraception. Let's go back to the pre-1965 Supreme Court ruling that it is a crime to sell or make available contraceptive devices. And essentially, that's a Catholic, ultra-conservative Jewish, and a few other faiths view. It's not secular, but yeah, that's what these people are bringing. And I think that unless we elect different senators and representatives, there's more than that coming. You dive into the literature of people who are in the Federalist Society, people who are in the radical right. They are developing this legal theory that you can only have laws consistent with what the law was in 1787 when we adopted the Constitution. And I'm making a deliberately absurdist argument here, but I guess that'll be the end of air travel and air traffic control and rules on licensing pilots.
Yeah, the modern age is threatened. Eric says if politics is a pendulum, there's going to be one hell of a swing to the left in response to all this crap eventually. Boy, that seems like a long way from where we are, but maybe, I don't know.
That's something I've been thinking about, because I'm so sorry, but it's the question I wanted to ask you is Trump stacked the courts with all these justices. And I believe are they lifetime appointments, or how long? Because how long does it take? Are we going to be dealing with this for decades? The pendulum might swing, but it's going to take a long time to get rid of these people.
All Article III federal judges, so District Court, Court of Appeals, Supreme Court, those are lifetime appointments. So many judges don't stay. They leave and they go into private practice. Or Merrick Garland left the D.C. Court of Appeals to become Attorney General. But it is a lifetime appointment. Back at the time we started this country, you were unlikely to serve 20 years. Clarence Thomas, the longest serving justice, has been on the court for, I think it's 33 years now, maybe at 34. We need to recognize that conditions change, and the Constitution is a blueprint. It is not the final design, which will continually change. I'm thinking of Stuart Brand's book, How Buildings Learn, in which he shows all sorts of buildings over long periods of time, and different owners had them, and how they alter the buildings to fit the needs of the time. There's a real fundamental problem here in judicial ethics. There's a fundamental problem with Mitch McConnell's approach to stacking the courts. Roughly 1 in 4 District Court, Circuit Court of Appeals justices, and 1/3 of the Supreme Court are Trump appointees. And those people were picked for ideological reasons, not because of their distinguished jurisprudence. None of the Trump appointees, and Justice Gorsuch is a sophisticated thinker. I don't like his thinking, but he's a very sophisticated thinker. But he can't hold a candle to Ketanji Jackson Brown, the black woman appointed to the court recently, who in her very first words from the bench went after one of the big lies in America. The Constitution is race neutral, her other justices said. And she said, no, it's not. It's full of race. It's all over the place. 3/5 of a person, amendments, et cetera, et cetera. And anyhow, we all need to be very worried about this. I've long been in favor of expanding the Supreme Court to either 15 members or 17 members. I don't want to go to 11. That's just sort of patently somewhere else. And appointing justices who are reasonable, rational people. They're not picked because they have some preset agenda wherever it is. And you need to be cautious about saying, well, we'll get a bunch of liberal judges and things will go our way. No, you want judges who are going to act the way judges are supposed to, interpreting the Constitution.
I mean, we've had this conversation a bit already because I'm way for expanding the court. And I'd always thought, I think you were the one who really enlightened me on this, as I recall, so this is kind of why I'm asking you again, that you don't need a congressional, a 2/3 congressional vote on that. You can expand the court. The bar for expanding the court is really low. Joe Biden could expand the Supreme Court. Couldn't he? Take us through that again. If you actually wanted to.
To increase, the number of justices in the Supreme Court is set by Congress.
Okay.
So you need 51 senators if you can get to a vote. Remember, we have the 60 vote rule that makes it undemocratic. But ignoring that, 51 votes, and in the House, a majority plus one, and you can change the number of people who are on the Supreme Court. You can't, with current justices, force them to retire, but I think that there's an enormous amount of power the Senate Judiciary Committee has to embarrass Justice Thomas, to embarrass Chief Justice Roberts, who's an institutionalist. The Senate has the power to investigate Thomas's finances, and we know that his wife has received hundreds of thousands of dollars from people who had issues before the court. And here's a loophole that should be looked at. A lot was made after ProPublica revealed these millions of dollars of vacation trips about the fact that Harlan Crow has never had a case before the court. Well, wait a second. Harlan Crow is a founder of the Club for Growth. It had a case before the court in 2001. He's still on the board there. The American Enterprise Institute, which is a pro-business think tank, quote unquote, research and marketing organization in Washington, it does not have cases. Harlan Crow's on the board there and has given them a lot of money. But you know what they do? They have their fellows file briefs in court cases. So it'll say, Peter Wallison, senior fellow, AEI, and he'll file a brief. That's just a ruse to what's going on here. And the question that should really be put to Justice Thomas under oath by the Senate Judiciary Committee is this. Do you think that that Mr. Crow would have spent millions of dollars wining and dining your wife and flying you in private jets if you were a traffic court judge, sir?
Sure.
And by the way, and the second question is, and how many times has the Justice Thomas, have you had Mr. Crow stay overnight at your home at your expense?
Well, you know something, David, the faux righteous indignation that Clarence Thomas cranked up for the confirmation hearing, and I'm sure he's capable of marshaling at a moment's notice. I think you'd see that on display. But even so, you're right. I mean, there is and I think you're seeing it in Tennessee. You saw the power of the people. You saw the power of nationally embarrassing a legislative body, and they walked it back right away. So,
well, they didn't walk it back. The local legislators in Nashville and Memphis put the guys back in office temporarily, and then they have to run for office again. When the first of the two Justins reappeared on the floor of the House yesterday and got up and spoke, the speaker slammed the gavel and in the most contemptuous way said, "Out of order." There's been reporting since then by Judd Legum, and my friend Phil Williams, who's one of the best TV investigative reporters in the country, is looking into the Speaker of the House of Tennessee may not live in his district, which the Tennessee Constitution requires. U.S. Constitution doesn't. You could be the congressperson from San Francisco and live in Oakland under federal law. Now, California is a state law, if I recall, that prevents that. But my congressman in Western New York here in Rochester could live somewhere else in the state, but they had to live in the state. But the Tennessee Constitution is very clear. Members of the legislature have to live in their district, and the law says that you are presumed to live where your spouse and children live and children go to school. Well, that starts from his district. So maybe the person who should be expelled is the Speaker of the House in Tennessee.
That's wild. That really is wild. David, so appreciate you. You know him, the Pulitzer Prize winner. You should pick up a book or two. Crack. If you want to see how rich America has taken advantage of the rest of America, pick up one of David's books related to that. But if you want to learn about the true mobster quality that Trump has had all his life, pick up any one of David's books on Trump. I mean, it's amazing. It's alarming. In fact, you know what I'd love to do at some point? I'd love to tell one of those stories from one of the Trump books, because they're incredible stories, and they're true.
Let's do two of them in a future show. Let's do the 6th, 7th, and 8th graders that Donald Trump plied with liquor, limousines, and hotel rooms so they would gamble because they had money. Now, remember, we're not talking about a 19-year-old who's dolled up. We're talking about a 6th grader.
Right.
And that's in The Making of Donald Trump and in Temples of Chance. And let's also talk about the chapter in The Making of Donald Trump showing mercy about the major international cocaine trafficker Donald was involved with up to his eyeballs for a decade, who he did extraordinary favors for that make no sense whatsoever unless, as I show in the book, they were in the cocaine trafficking business together. And then what he did makes absolutely perfect sense.
So incredible. Yeah, good stuff. All right, for the next time. David Cay Johnston. Thanks, David. Hi, it's Mark, and I thought that was great. Hit the notification bell. You'll know whenever there's a new video being dropped, and please subscribe to our channel to help us save the universe.